You know how it goes. They love what we make, but not us. But a story like that, a pain like that, lasts forever. That's Candyman. Candyman is how we deal with the fact that these things happen, that they're still happening.
Francisco de Goya. Yes, the famous expressionistic Spanish painter, known probably for striking representations of Spain in the grips of great political upheaval, a country being torn apart by a decrepit regime clinging to its power, or of images of people suffering under reactionary tyranny. He also suffered, in the last years of his life, a debilitating mental health crisis, a period of stress and personal anguish that would lead him to create, in secret, some of his most haunting and iconic works, most famous of which was Saturn Devouring His Children. Goya was a professional artist, but these works were different. They were clearly not made for profit. They were the products of his own torment, which, according to some grisly rumors, are purported to have been made in part by his own literal blood and other bodily fluids. These were made on the walls of his home, not on a canvas. They were blatantly never meant to see the light of day. A person's home, after all, is not an exhibition, nor is a man's life. So it's ironic then, after Goya passed away, his work did see the light of day. Photographs were taken of the walls of his home. These images have been preserved and displayed, which is why we know of them today. Apparently in defiance of the wishes of a man for whom this work represents a dark and personal hell, not something I imagine he would have wished anyone to gawk at. I bring this up because this is essentially how the film Velvet Buzzsaw begins.
Something truly goddamn strange is going on!
Velvet Buzzsaw is, in many ways, not a perfect film. It's very campy and strangely executed and ends a bit abruptly, to be honest. But it has a simple and effective message, which I have been thinking about. It is a story about the art world in Los Angeles, and it begins when one of our main characters, an art dealer, discovers that one of her neighbors, who has recently passed away, was a painter of a strange but incredible talent. Yet his artwork, apparently, sits in his apartment with no one to inherit it, having never known any material praise or acclaim in his entire life. So she and her colleagues steal it. And they claim, of course, that they do so only because they care for exhibiting this incredible talent, lest the world be deprived of viewing such genius, lest the critics be deprived of such incredible artistry. But obviously this is less than the truth, which sucks for them, because it turns out these paintings are super fucking cursed. So it's fairly obvious what the point of this story is. All who disturb the work of this artist to exploit and display it are punished for using his art without his consent, for disobeying the wishes of a dead man. Velvet Buzzsaw is otherwise very preoccupied with the purpose of art, or at the very least, the purest intent of an artist. The greedy critics and the dealers are contrasted with John Malkovich's character, who is an artist himself, who spends most of the film disillusioned with the business he finds himself in. In the final scene of the film, we see him creating drawing on the California beach, drawn into the sand. Art that is necessarily impermanent, destined to be claimed by the tide, illustrating that art doesn't exist to be consumed, and certainly not consumed in the capitalist sense of the word.
This is a slaughterhouse.
And I bring all this up because of Candyman.
He chose you. He has purpose for you.
Tell everyone. New to the neighborhood.
Both Candyman films, because they both, in their own way, like Velvet Buzzsaw, have something to say about the people telling stories and speaking on behalf of the dead through media, whether that media be art or journalism or something else, and the purity or lack thereof of their intent. And most interestingly, what a very complicated quandary all of this remains. The franchise of Candyman has many permutations, each illuminating about the social subject matter they discuss, but also about the beliefs of the people who made them. The original story of Candyman comes from the short story written by Clive Barker entitled The Forbidden, appearing in his 5th volume of the Books of Blood. The thesis of The Forbidden is a theme that the Candyman franchise has in common. The disenfranchised, the poor, the mentally ill, the undesired class of society are ghettoized, segregated from society, banished from sight and from empathy, only paid attention when shocking crime and violence happens in their midst, briefly put under the foggy microscope until they once again fade into the public's apathy and distaste. And for our purposes, the story lays out a lot of groundwork for the conceptual way people in privilege interact with the othered, underclass, and oppressed.
If you would learn, the fiend said, just a little from me, you would not beg to live. His voice dropped to a whisper. I am rumor, he sang in her ear. It is a blessed condition, believe me, to live in people's dreams, to be whispered at street corners, but not to have to be. Do you understand? Her weary body understood. Her nerves, tired of jangling, understood. The sweetness he offered was life without living, was to be dead, but remembered everywhere, immortal, in gossip and graffiti. Be my victim, he said. No, she murmured. I won't force it upon you, he replied, the perfect gentleman. I won't oblige you to die, but think, if I kill you here, if I unhook you. He traced the path of the promised wound with his hook. It ran from groin to neck. Think how they would mark this place with their talk. Pointed out as they passed by. She died there, the woman with the green eyes. Your death would be a parable to frighten children with. Lovers would use it as an excuse to cling closer together. She had been right. This was a seduction. Was fame ever so easy? He asked. She shook her head. I'd prefer to be forgotten, she replied, than be remembered like that. He made a tiny shrug. What do the good know, except what the bad teach them by their excesses?
Barker's Candyman isn't merely a boogeyman for the people of Spectre Street. He exists as a kind of patron saint of the suffering of the poor. He represents a cruel, hollow irony that almost sees the death and suffering of the downtrodden as martyrdom. But unlike certain liberal politicians in the real world, he sees the horror and futility in this idea of martyrdom. Because Candyman and his victims are just urban legends, ghost stories of murder. They are not social change, and in time their relevance will fade.
You're mine now.
The 1991 Candyman film shows the titular ghost and his machinations as a spirit representing a people's angst and feelings of defeat, ultimately underscoring the feeling of doom and misery for the poor and black in America. Murders committed in the bad parts of town by bad sorts of people, wrapped up in ghost stories, will never move anyone to abolish poverty. It will only reaffirm the scaremongering about the poor, the homeless, the mentally ill, the non-white, and everyone else on the fringes of society. So it was refreshing to see Candyman 2021 show us the murders committed in broad daylight. Not the ones committed by Candyman, but by the society that made Candyman, as the real evil at the center of this story. a truth that was always there in every permutation, but not given words properly until now. Furthermore, it addresses the confused and self-flagellating nature of the titular spirit and the violence he commits and recommits against the demographic he represents. Tananarive Du told Polygon, "I see it as a course correction, frankly. This film is a course correction from the original because there are so many scenes that black audiences did not ask for. They did not ask for him to have a background as a lynching victim. But if you're going to do that, of course, you're going to have to establish empathy from black audiences. Now, where black audiences lost track in the first Candyman is that he was attacking people in Cabrini Green. Is it fair to feel like you're rooting for Candyman? I think some audience members were rooting for Candyman in the original for sure. He's our monster. But he was killing some people who really did nothing to him and didn't deserve it. The new film by Nia DaCosta is basically a woke Candyman, right? You take Candyman from sort of this amoral kind of figure, like he's just going to kill indiscriminately if you conjure him. You kind of bring it on yourself, literally, if you're going to conjure him. But in this version, Candyman doesn't just represent the original artist who is lynched in the original. He also represents other victims of police brutality or lynching or attacks throughout history. It's like very much that say their names mentality, that you want to honor and remember those who have suffered. He's become kind of a general figure symbolizing that suffering over generations. Tony Todd is in this very briefly, but at a scene stealer at the end of the movie. Just one line, "Tell everyone," which I swear gives me goosebumps every time I see it. Candyman has been weaponized. I think, as you put it, as an avenging angel, and not just because he's black, but because he has a point of view and because he has a purpose that is more defined, I think, than it was in the original. By the end of DaCosta's film, Candyman has become something he wasn't before in either version of the story. He is more than a patron saint of violence, and he has been martyred, it seems, for the last time. He is something of an avenging angel, and he is not content to be remembered only through horror and misery. He wants more than a legend. He is here to spread the truth. No longer manifestation, it seems, but an active agent.
Go back. Pain like that lasts forever.
Candyman ain't a he. Candyman's the whole damn hive.
Let's talk about ghost stories. In colonialism, briefly, we don't have time to talk about all of it. One of the most common features of tales of haunting throughout history is the idea of the spirit with unfinished business. It's easy to see why humans would cling to this kind of notion. Life is short, and then you die. Often abruptly, and before your time, whatever that means. Whether or not you believe in an afterlife, there's an obvious impulse in everyone to see life ended as a life unfinished. This kind of folklore has persisted from word of mouth to the novel to the horror film, and will likely continue on from there. But I believe there's another dimension to this kind of story that is more anthropological and even concerned with the concept of seeking justice. The ghost as means to exhume the past, literally and figuratively. From Wilkie Collins to Coraline, there is a frequent narrative of the ghost wishing someone among the living to discover the final resting place of their earthly remains and perhaps ensure that the body is identified, and often evidence of the injustice done to them brought to light. The hero of such tales is usually a stranger to the intrigue and the murder that they've uncovered. They are the hapless new tenant moving into a new house. They are an innocent bystander. But more often than not, they're some kind of investigator. So in a metatextual sense, it's easy enough to see these tales as analogous to the efforts to investigate history, to some extent to solve crimes, but also I think to studying or finding inspiration in communities and cultures foreign to our protagonists, whether we realize it or not. In Edward Said's Orientalism, a key component discussed in its early chapters is that a great many would-be Orientalists are Westerners, which is to say foreigners of the East, going to the East to discover it and document their experiences there. But what they really end up doing is unconsciously looking for confirmation of their biases, looking for proof of the stories and stereotypes they already have in their own minds. And in many cases, there is nothing malicious in this. It is an unconscious practice that comes from unquestioned Eurocentrism and commonly held racist views, but nonetheless succeeds in perpetuating the propaganda and misinformation rather than properly humanizing and investigating the reality of the people they come into contact with. People of other cultures and classes are ever the object, never the subject of this unchallenged gaze. They may approach with sympathy, but never with proper empathy. And beyond Europe's interaction with the Orient, this is a tradition of unconscious, thoughtless dehumanization nearly as old as human civilization itself. But it is particularly harmful coming from the privileged, and this continues to this day in many different forms. The Candyman franchise has always been centered on this kind of compassionate classism, but the ways each differ are instructive. In Barker's story and Rose's movie, we have Helen Lyle, an upper-class grad student and also blue-eyed, blonde-haired white woman attempting to discover the daily lives of lower-class residents of Spectre Street and Cabrini Green, respectively. She says for academic purposes. In the story, she even refers to her endeavor as an investigation into the semiotics of urban despair. My theory here is one that correlates to the archetype of the unfinished business kind of ghost story, and the exploitation of cultural pain and tragedy, whether it be mercenary or otherwise. It is what I'll call cultural selective deafness, or even blindness, the inability to listen, displayed by the privileged. To take an example in another horror film, and to even cite a non-Eurocentric example, take the film Ringu, or even its American remake, The Ring. The story concerns the curse of a haunted videotape that proves to be a message from beyond the grave from an apparently murdered girl. Our protagonist is an investigative reporter, chasing the mystery with an almost perverse journalistic glee at first, until the curse falls on her in particular. It becomes clear to her that the murdered girl wishes her remains, which are residing at the bottom of a well, to be exhumed. On our protagonist's journey to uncover that truth, she is identified with a narrative of a perceived injustice against this dead child. With the information given, she thinks she knows what has happened. The twist is that she has grossly misunderstood the full reality. The murdered girl is apparently not an entirely innocent victim, but there is in fact something supernatural and sinister about her. Not realizing this, our lead pays dearly for the mistake. And while very far-fetched and a little detached from reality, Ringu does bear one poignant observation. The crux of the story rests on our outside investigator convincing themselves through their bias that they are acting altruistically and pursuing justice. Acting in this case partly through desperation, but also partly through a kind of hero complex. Like the art dealers in Velvet Buzzsaw, selfishly ignoring the words of the dead, Ringu benevolently misunderstanding and not fully listening to the dead. Both represent a failure to the obvious facts before them. And Ringu also seemingly rebukes the idea that the sins of the past can be rectified once exhumed. When Sadako, or Samara in the American remake, is apparently freed, the curse does not end, it only spreads. In the end, the only way to escape the violence of the past is to copy the tape and pass the curse on, to tell as many as one can and never look back. No matter who is harmed, the violence and pain will continue. Works like Orientalism show us that beyond the malicious and opportunistic efforts of colonialism and imperialism and their related structures, these unjust systems and ideologies persist because of a fundamental deficit of empathy, a true self-centered nature that is encouraged. I don't think it is entirely human nature, but I do think it is encouraged and goes very troublingly unquestioned. So it's interesting to bring it back to Candyman and how this all pertains to the character of Anthony McCoy, the protagonist of the 2021 film. He is an artist who gained some popularity, representing polemic but palatable, at least for the 2020s and 2010s, body of work that drew from experiences of black pain. But on the other hand, he grew up outside the ghetto, and on some level it seems he feels he is above the mire of intergenerational poverty and violence he might have otherwise faced. In certain scenes, he acts superior to the arm of gentrification that has touched Cabrini Green and projects like it, yet is immediately called out in his own complicity as a yuppie artist who is participating in and benefiting from said gentrification. He takes his agent's advice at the beginning of the film to latch onto a trendy story about the poor black experience, in this case, Candyman, underscoring how even awareness of injustice about black people can be commodified. The film also walks a compelling line between an artist's supposed altruistic intentions and the desire for success and legitimacy, which with Anthony, as a black man living in America, can't help but take on a slightly more complex dimension, as not being a clear-cut choice of right and wrong. Anthony has some privilege, but he is still fundamentally an underprivileged citizen in America. And the final twist of the tale is that he was from Cabrini Green the whole time, the infant rescued from the Candyman's sacrificial altar we see in the finale of the first film. It's an irony that in exploiting a tragedy, Anthony is subsumed into it, and even more so, was always a part of it, even though he believed he wasn't. But where this Candyman differs from others is that Anthony is called upon to be a sacrifice for something more, and in many ways more than a sacrifice. He callously attached himself to this tragedy for profit, but instead learned that he had much more of a stake in it than he realized. He could let it sink him, or he could embrace it and do something. Every version of Candyman, though, seems to be grappling sometimes only implicitly with the notion of the power and the problem of stories. There's an age-old debate, of course, about who has the right to talk about the experiences of certain demographics, particularly the oppressed, the racialized, the gendered, and many others. The question of is it only the people who have lived these experiences who have the right to speak of them? Or do allies also have a right to tell the stories? Or at least to help? Many would probably agree that those affected by inequality and marginalization and violence would know best about how to discuss those experiences. But on the other hand, there is also this backhanded side which decides that this is the only kind of story that these people get to tell in popular media. Particularly, it seems, in the case of racialized people in America and the Commonwealth. There is a strange space that black people occupy in 21st century art in our supposedly post-racial society. It's remained one of implicitly justifying their own existence and inclusion in narratives, to the point that being black may as well be a genre in its own. You still can't escape the trite slavery epics or the clueless why can't we be friends Jim Crow Oscar bait movies, and it still doesn't feel particularly common to allow a person of color to play a straightforward leading character. There can't just be black actors on Bridgerton. We have to explain why are black people in 18th century England in this fantasy romance show on Netflix. We couldn't possibly just let it be. No, we gotta explain it. And Candyman director Nia DaCosta has also felt the restraint of these little boxes artists of color are put into. So much so that the film Candyman can't help but comment on it. She tells the Chicago Sun-Times that line of exploiting racial pain in order to make art for white people was really what this story was all about, but also struggling with your own history and how, as an artist or a person, do you reconcile it? And in another interview for Icon, as a black filmmaker, I definitely see a lot of myself in Anthony, and it's definitely something I wanted to touch on in this film. There's also the reality that some individuals do not want to be forced to exhume their pain just for the sake of seeking justice or elucidating the world about these buried sins. In cases of public inquiry into general injustices, into generational injustices, such as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Indigenous peoples in my country, in Canada, for every survivor who is eager for justice to tell their story, there's another who does not wish to be involved. For them, they feel that it would not do them any benefit to dig up their horrific past just so white people can apologize to them. And neither opinion is invalid. Not everyone will find closure in revisiting trauma. They may just find more pain. So what right do we have to disturb them? It's a point of comparison that neither Helen nor Anthony ask anyone they interview if they're actually okay with them using the stories of Candyman and the stories of the real people who died and became the legend of Candyman, a central component of these marginalized people's strife, in their work. And in the tradition of ghost stories, they paid the price for not asking. But what's interesting is that instead of meeting a grim demise, they are drawn further in, consumed by the tale of tragedy, as if to chastise them for being tourists to other people's pain. I have a level of a few. As a storyteller, I think constantly about this back and forth between my empathy for diverse stories and the credibility and right I have to tell. I am white and was raised male, even though I'm not a man, and I was raised lower middle class in a country with socialized healthcare and education and relative safety and privilege for people who look like I do. I can only be an ally to the kinds of people and stories that still interest me and my work, people whose stories I feel deserve awareness, but nothing more than an ally. As much as research as I may do, I will never truly know in my own experience what it feels like to be non-white, to be a woman, to grow up as a woman, and many other things in a world that is set up to exploit and dehumanize said people. I try to remember that everyone is human, and that I can extend them human empathy. But there are some human experiences which, while I may understand, I will never live through, and I should not imagine that I have felt what those people have felt. On the same token, there is no monolith of experience for any one demographic, no matter their shared history, no matter how it might seem. And I do still believe that if you have empathy, you can tell a story. You can tell any story, just as an ally. Because I also feel that yours is really the only story you can tell as if it were your own. Another thought that has plagued me while thinking about Candyman is the metatextual irony that's raised, honestly, by its very existence. It is a story about Black people's experiences and showcasing their tragedy through abstraction and horror fiction, and it is told by Black people, and it clearly has a prescient and important statement to make. Yet, it is also a film sold to the public. It's a piece of art, yes, but it is also a product. Nia DaCosta and the crew of this film are not unlike Anthony. Artists and workers drawing inspiration from their own experiences, yes, but also experiences not entirely their own, to make a body of work that on some level they hope will bring them material success. And it has. Stories, as gross as it sounds to say, stories about Black pain and institutional injustice are indeed trendy in the 2020s. Candyman was briefly the highest grossing movie in America this year. It's the kind of existential questions that the very text of this movie raises about itself. Did they have a right to make this piece of art, even if this piece of art for profit, even if they identify with it? Is it okay to profit if said profiting means their message will reach more people? I guess that's the paradox of art under capitalism. Candyman asks a very thorny question which purposely has no answer in the continuum that we inhabit. On the one hand, art based on tragedy can be a powerful educator and a plea for justice, but that art can be created for profit, and causes can be co-opted by capitalism. Anything can be sold to you. And even when motivated by justice over profit, is an artist allowed to tell a story that isn't completely theirs, or even a story that is theirs but superimposed over the assumed collective experience of many people, that they, even if they do belong to them? Is a story told perhaps incompletely from an outsider's perspective still not valuable if it leads to discourse and awareness? And it seems clear that Candyman knows on some level that these are questions we will not be in consensus about. Because while many traumas are cultural, societal, and legion perspectives on trauma, are individual and personal. All this tale can really do is make its message clear. The other films I've discussed don't really have an answer to the question either. Though as a corollary, Velvet Buzzsaw is very clear that no matter who has the right to talk about your tragedy, they are very clear that no one has a right to profit from it. That is a choice. As Maya Angelou said, once we know better, hopefully we can do better. The final paragraphs of Barker's The Forbidden can't help but complement the final sentiments of both Candyman films, and I believe communicates something of the complicated impact of tragedy on culture and society. Perhaps they would remember her, as he had said they might, finding her cracked skull in tomorrow's ashes. Perhaps she might become, in time, a story with which to frighten children. She had lied, saying she preferred death to such questionable fame. She did not. As to her seducer, he laughed as the conflagration sniffed them out. There was no permanence for him in this night's death. His deeds were on 100 walls and 10,000 lips, and should he be doubted again, his congregation would summon him with their sweetness. He had reason to laugh, so as the flames crept upon them, did she, as through the fire she caught sight of a familiar face moving between the onlookers. It was Trevor, her husband. Poor dupe, she thought. Following his antics, she willed him to look past the flames, in the hope that he might see her burning. Not so that he could save her from death. She was long past hope of that, but because she pitied him in his bewilderment, and she wanted to give him, though he would not have thanked her for it, something to be haunted by.
That, and a story to tell.
And thus, as Daniel Robitaille, the first link in the Candyman chain, says,